It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Eric Mazur to the University of Waterloo. He is the Bolkansky Professor of Physics and Applied Physics at Harvard University, and he's an internationally recognized scientist and researcher. Dr. Mazur obtained his PhD at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands and arrived at Harvard in the early 1980s, where he basically set up camp and has been there ever since. He's made numerous important contributions. I'll read this list of areas of expertise so I don't miss anything. Just spectroscopy, light scattering, the interaction of ultra-short laser pulses with materials, and nanophotonics. He's the author or co-author of over 200 publications and holds 12 patents. Over his career, he's been the recipient of numerous significant awards and received a number of prestigious appointments at quite a number of renowned institutions. In the interest of preserving time for him and not listening to me go on about those, I'll let you do the web surfing that you can do to find out about those, and Wikipedia is a very good place to start. He's also served on numerous high-level government committees and councils and serves as a consultant to the electronics and telecommunications industry. In 2006, he founded Psionics, which is a company that is commercializing black silicon, a new form of silicon developed in his laboratory. In addition to his scientific and entrepreneurial work, Dr. Mazur is interested in science, outreach, and public perception of science. He's one of those unique individuals, and to us regular mortals, one of these annoying individuals, who has managed to certainly make a spot for himself on the world stage as far as scientific research goes, but also he's on the cutting edge of pedagogy. He has written extensively on education and is the author of the book Peer Instruction, a User's Manual, a book that explains how to teach large classes interactively. He's also, in 2006, had the award-winning DVD on interactive teaching. In preparation for this introduction, I did a bit of web research last night and spent, well, I would say an obscene amount of time looking at YouTube videos of Dr. Mazur, certainly a significant amount of time looking at YouTube videos. And one of them is 80 minutes in length, and if you've got time to look at it, it's certainly very, very engaging, and I'd encourage you to do that. And one of the gems that I took away from that was a quote that he offered up in an interview. He said, you can forget facts, but you can't forget understanding. So that kind of resonated quite profoundly. So with that as a teaser, then, it's my pleasure to ask Dr. Mazur to come forward and present his talk, Memorization or Understanding, Are We Teaching the Right Thing? Dr. Mazur.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and I'm overwhelmed by the interest displayed by the large number of people here present. I actually came to the University of Waterloo 28 years ago. I was at Harvard for a one-year postdoc. I was never going to become a professor. My father was a professor, a physicist. My mother was an art historian teaching in academia. I was going to do something useful in my life. And I actually had a job lined up in industry, but then my father said, why don't you take a one-year postdoc in the US? Well, here I am, 29 years later. I never left Harvard. I'm not still a postdoc. I would never have imagined that I would be coming back here after 28 years to talk about pedagogy. And if you would have asked this question on the screen there, are we teaching the right thing? You know, shortly after I started teaching at Harvard, I would have said, of course I'm doing the right thing in my class. When I became an assistant professor at Harvard in 1984, I was asked to teach the Intro Physics for Pre-Med course. I didn't know that none of my colleagues wanted to teach that class, so I had no choice anyway, so I just gladly accepted that assignment. And the question, how am I going to teach that class, really never came up in my mind, which is sort of strange, right? Because when you start doing something new, the first question you should ask yourself is, how am I going to do it? Well, that question did not come up. It was very clear how I was going to teach. I was going to do to my students what my teachers had done to me. And I didn't want to be mean or anything, but I just assumed, I learned physics this way, sitting in a classroom not very different from this one. Therefore, that's how physics is learned. Now, to make matters worse, what happened was that very quickly I received signs that what I was doing was the right thing. What are the metrics by which we tend to evaluate the quality of our education? Well, I can think of two. One is the dreaded end of semester questionnaire, which I'm sure you use here as well. Well, when physicists teach pre-meds, that end of semester evaluation is a pretty daunting thing, because most of my colleagues would come close to committing suicide at the end of the term when they saw how the pre-meds evaluated them. But not so for me. I got 4.5, 4.7 on a 5-point scale. So clearly the students liked what I was doing in class. So that's one metric. The other metric is my students' performance on exams. Now normally when we teach physics to pre-meds in the US, I don't know how it is in Canada, but in the US, the intro physics course for pre-meds is an algebra-based course. It's not a calculus-based course, but not so at Harvard. At Harvard, we give the pre-meds a full-blown calculus-based course. I could ask these students to solve triple integrals to calculate, a moment of inertia of some complicated three-dimensional object. I'm not even sure I would do well on an exam on questions like that. But my students, by and large, were able to do very well. So in short, they gave me high evaluations. They liked me. They did well on what I considered complicated exams. Obviously, I was doing the right thing. And that illusion of thinking I was doing the right thing went on for many, many years, until after teaching for some 7 years or so, I came across a series of articles in the American Journal of Physics, which I normally did not read, but somebody pointed it out to me, written by David Hestenes, he's now emeritus, a professor of physics at Arizona State University. And what Hestenes did was investigate students' understanding of Newton's laws. Now, I presume not everybody here is a scientist. We might have people from other schools and departments here. My talk is going to be about pedagogy, not about physics, but I'm a physicist, so in order to give you some examples, I'll use a little bit of physics, but whether or not you can follow that physics does not matter, because it's the pedagogy that is important. But I want to be specific, so there'll be a few examples. Each time you hear me say the word physics, mentally substitute your own discipline. So if you're a chemist, chemistry, and so on, I'm sure it'll make just as much sense. But for those of you who are not familiar with the curriculum in physics, week 1, you describe motion. It's called kinematics. Week 2, you describe forces that cause motion and the relation between kinematics and forces. And that the concept of force is embodied by Newton's 3 laws. And then after that, the next, whatever it is, 11 weeks or so, build on top of that concept of force. If you do not have a solid understanding of Newton's 3 laws, the rest of physics is basically wasted on you, because it's impossible to make sense of it without mastering Newton's laws. Anyway, Hestenes did the following. He developed a multiple choice test to test students' understanding of Newton's 3 laws. And let me give you what turns out to be the hardest question on this force concept inventory. A heavy truck and a light car collide head-on on the highway. The force exerted by the heavy truck on the light car is A, larger than that of the light car on the heavy truck. B, they're equal to each other in magnitude. C, the light car exerts a larger force on the heavy truck than the other way around. D, they're not exerting any force on each other. They are just in each other's way. Now you're laughing. I don't think any physicist in his right mind would ever come up with such an answer. And that's the problem, right? If you know the material, that's the problem actually with multiple choice test. if you know your material, it's very easy to come up with the right answer, but it's very difficult to come up with plausible wrong answers. Now, you may think this is not at all a plausible answer, but the way Hesnes developed this force concept inventory was not by dreaming up incorrect wrong choices. No, what he did was give these questions as free response questions to a large number of students and then tabulate the most frequent wrong responses, and this was one of them. And that's what makes this test so incredibly powerful, because if you have the wrong mental model, you'll choose these wrong answers. Anyway, in spite of the fact that most students have no trouble reciting Newton's third law, which you may have heard of, action is reaction of the force exerted by A on B is equal in magnitude to the force exerted by B on A. If you replace A and B by light car and small truck, students all of a sudden forget everything about Newton's third law and imagine the larger object exerting a larger a force of greater magnitude on the smaller object than the other way around. Well, I looked at that. I, as you heard, was educated in Europe. I had many years of physics in high school, 5 years in total. So by the time I got to university, I had a pretty solid understanding of Newton's laws. And you tend to project your own experiences onto everybody, so I thought, everybody, by the time they get to college, understand Newton's law. So I was about to discard that whole test when I saw the data that were associated with it. He had tested thousands of students in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, California. And because the force concept inventory, this FCI, this multiple choice test, does not contain any jargon. Yes, it contains words like force and acceleration and velocity, but we all have some notions of these concepts even before taking physics, right? Because we use those words in our daily life. So because they don't really contain any jargon, you can give the test to anyone, regardless of whether they've had physics or not. You might not get the right answers, but the person will be able to answer the questions without, you know, failing to understand the words in the question themselves. So that means you can give the FCI before instruction and then repeat it after instruction to see what the gain is, to what extent you've changed or you've improved people's understanding of these concepts. And he'd done that for thousands of students and shown that the gain in an introductory physics course at the college level is absolutely minimal. Well, I thought, you know, there must be some kind of a disease that rages in the southwest of the United States. But then I read another analysis he had done. You see, he had tested so many students that he could group them in different categories because there were a number of classes where the instructor, had won a teaching award. A teaching award based on student evaluations, of course. So he grouped all of those students together and then took the pre-test average for all of them and the post-test average to determine the gain obtained by award-winning teachers. Another category was one where the teacher didn't like large classes and subdivided the students into small group instruction. A third group was instructors who did a lot of hands-on demonstrations. And the fourth group, which I thought was kind of interesting, was a group of students who had teachers who had scored absolutely at the bottom of the end of semester evaluation. The dullest, driest, most boring teachers you can imagine. You know, the teacher where the dean says, you're no longer teaching that course. Well, so for each of these three groups, he determined, four groups, he determined the gain. And you know what? Within statistical significance, there is no difference across these four groups. No difference between the award-winning teacher and the dull, dry, boring teacher. In other words, it doesn't make any difference what we do in front of these students. They learn next to nothing. Well, I saw that and I thought, no way, not my students, not my Harvard students. But you know, I'm a scientist, so when you make a statement like that, you better prove it, right? And I felt challenged. I thought, I am going to try this out on my own students. Unfortunately, it was too late to do a pretest. We were already in November, which means we had 2 months of the course behind us. We were dealing with rotational dynamics, parallel access theorem. I mean, Newton's laws were a distant memory. Well, hopefully not the laws themselves, but us going over them was a distant memory. But I was dying to get these data, so I thought, you know, I'm going to tell the students that we're going to do this little test. So one day I walked into class and I said, look, I'm going to give you a quiz. You know, if you say test to pre-meds, they freak out. So I thought, I'm going to call it a quiz. And you don't have to worry about it. It's not going to affect your final grade in any way. I'm just giving you this to assess the effectiveness of my own teaching. And as I said that, I realized I'd just taken away any incentive for them to take this test. I mean, you tell a pre-med this is not going to affect your final grade, and they don't even show up anymore. So I thought I have to give them a reason to actually come and complete this quiz. So I said, look, next week we have a midterm that's coming up. If you take this test seriously, not only will it give me a chance to evaluate my teaching, it will also give you an opportunity to pinpoint any difficulties you have with the material. Now, as soon as I said that, I realized I told them a huge lie. I mean, here we're dealing with rotational dynamics, calculus integration, this, that, and the other, and this was something that we had done in the force concept inventory. It was something we had done in week 2. So I was worried my students would be offended by the simplicity of this test. They would revolt. Oh boy, were my worries quickly dispelled. Because hardly had the first group of students taken their seats in our computer classroom where we administered this test, or one student raised her hand and she said, Professor Mazur, how should I answer these questions? According to what you taught me, or according to the way I usually think about these things? I had no idea how to answer that question. And by the time the test had been completed, I had been dragged out of my ivory tower. And life in the classroom has not been the same ever since. So what I'd like to do in the next 40 minutes or so is get this message across, which to me now looks completely obvious and trivial, but I'll add some meat to it over the coming 40 minutes or so. And that is that we should really shift the focus from teaching to helping students learn. The focus should be on the learner, not on the teacher. And I'm going to do that in 3 parts. First, I'll talk a little bit about education. A word we use all the time, a word we take for granted because we sort of imagine we know exactly what we mean by education. But if you stop to think about it for a moment, and I were to challenge you to write down a concise definition of education on a piece of paper in front of you, I think many of us, including myself, would be struggling. What is it exactly that we're trying to accomplish? And that's important, right? Because before you start to talk about education, you really have to define what it is, because the way you do it, the way you assess the success of education, all hinge on our understanding of that word. But it's a word we actually never really stop to define. In physics, we have a similar term, right? In physics, perhaps the most important quantity is one that I'll be talking about tonight at the Perimeter Institute, time. Right? Physics is the science of change, in a sense, and you can't talk about change if you don't talk about time. But if you look in any physics textbook, time is not even defined. All physics textbooks rely on the intuitive notions that we all hold about time, and the only definition is that time is defined by the letter T. And if you try to write down a definition of time, try that. Think about it. How would you define time? Well, I think education is something similar. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Then I'll talk about peer instruction, which is what I did in my classroom after seeing how poorly my students did on this force concept inventory. And lastly, I'd like to show you some results, some data. And I want to emphasize that because I think it's absolutely important that we apply the same rigor, the same scholarship to our teaching that we do in our own disciplines. I'm often appalled when I go to a faculty meeting in my own department how perfectly respectable physicists, some of whom have won the Nobel Prize, completely abandon the scientific method when it comes to talking about education. All of a sudden, it's about anecdotes. My students learn better when I do this or that. Well, what does that statement mean? How do you know they learn better? Or my students like it if I do a lot of demonstrations. Well, like it is fine, but you know, what does that do for education? Right? Lee Schulman former president of the Carnegie Foundation, has a marvelous quote, which I want to give to you so you can use it when you go to a meeting and you see a scientist abandon the scientific method. Here's the quote, it's very short. "The plural of anecdote is not data." You do not validate an argument by just saying a lot of anecdotes. Unfortunately, most of the discussions in education are based on anecdotal evidence. And I want to show you that you can be just as rigorous and just as systematic about your approach to teaching as you are in your research. In a sense, I consider my classroom an extension to my lab. In the lab, we're firing photons at material. In the classroom, we're firing words at students. You know, you can measure the effect of firing words at students just as you can measure the effect of firing photons at materials, and then change something in your approach and see what the effect is. So that's why I'm going to show you data. So let's start by talking about education. Step into any classroom, including this one, right here, right now. And you're likely to see a scene that's very similar to the one on the screen behind me. And this is actually a picture of me teaching my class back in the early 90s when I was still teaching a totally traditional lecture class. The teacher in front, the students sitting in the benches. It's at once you can see that this dates back to quite a long time ago. The architecture dates back to the ancient Greek, the amphitheater. So it's thousands of years old, right? That architecture has just one single purpose, namely to focus the attention of many on one. I would like to ask you to give me a short description, preferably involving a verb, of the activity that is taking place on the screen behind me. And there are two verbs I do not want to hear, teaching and learning. I want to have another way of describing the activity that is taking place there.
Lecture.
Lecture is what, unfortunately, only one person is doing there, me, in front of the class. Actually, it's very interesting. The word lecture derives from the Latin verb for to read. And in fact, in the UK, I don't know if that's true in Canada too, but some people at university are called readers. Well, I'll tell you an amusing anecdote in just a second that actually is sort of ironic about that reading. Yeah, but that's not comprehensive of the entire activity. So I need more.
Explaining.
Explaining, again, that focuses on me in front of the class. I would like to see the whole thing.
Listening.
Listening, now we have the students, but not me.
Sleeping.
Actually, their heads are pretty straight, so. Engaged. Who's engaged?
The students.
Oh, you're very flattering to...
Transferring.
Transferring. Now we get to something that involves both. Transferring what?
Knowledge.
Transferring knowledge. Knowledge is a little bit of a vague word. I would have, but you're very close to what I wanted to say. Lectures focus on the delivery or transfer, as you said, of information. And you know what? The students had rubbed that in my face the first year that I taught, and I had ignored it. After all, you know, when there are annoying things, why would you focus on the negative? I like to concentrate on the positive, so I ignore negative things. Here's what happened. So the first year that I taught, I didn't ask myself, how am I going to teach? What do you think the question was that came up in my mind? What book am I going to use? So I went to a professor, a much more senior professor than me, who had taught the course before, and I asked him, what book do you use for this course? And he said, oh, we use Halliday and Resnick. I'm sure that many of you have had physics out of Halliday and Resnick. So I went to the bookstore, Harvard bookstore, and I ordered 150 copies of Halliday and Resnick. Now, as I walked back from the bookstore to my office, I was asking myself, you know, wait a minute. If all the students buy this book, what am I going to do in class? In Europe, you know, where I was educated, you would not buy the textbook. I mean, after all, why would you buy a textbook if the instructor presents it to you, right? Why spend $150 or whatever the equivalent was then? So I walked back and I thought, well, I'm going to ask my colleagues. So I went to him and I said, I asked him this question, and he said, well, don't worry, there are lots of physics textbooks. And he showed me his whole collection of introductory physics textbooks. And I looked around, and very quickly there was one that I picked out that I really liked for two reasons. One, it had a slightly different approach. Rather than starting with Newtonian mechanics, it started with a conservation principle, a conservation of momentum. So it had sort of jumbled up the sequence of topics a little bit. But the second reason was much more important. It was out of print. So the students couldn't get their hands on it. So for each class, I spent about 10 hours preparing a set of lecture notes to lecture from. And in class, I would lecture from those notes by either putting them on the overhead projector, as you see there, or write them on the board behind me. But because my approach deviated a little bit from the textbook, I gave my students copies of my lecture notes each class, and I handed it out at the end of the class. So as they walked out of the classroom, they could pick up a copy of those lecture notes. Now, why do you think I handed it out at the end of the classroom?
So the students would have to pay attention during the lecture.
So that they wouldn't just, well, actually, it was more devious than that. I didn't want them to pick up the notes and go back to bed, right? But in retrospect, isn't that already admitting that there's something wrong, right? Because that the focus really is on the delivery of information, because if a student can get the information out of the lecture notes and doesn't need to come, why prevent that from happening? Why force the students to come and sit there and listen to me, right? Well, I didn't realize any of that. But what happened was that after a few classes, a few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, some students came to me and said, Professor Mazur, couldn't we get a copy of your lecture notes at the beginning of each class period? This way we don't have to write down that much. And I'd indeed noticed that each time my pen went A on the overhead projector on the blackboard, 150 pens went A in the notebooks of the students. I once heard somebody describe the lecture process, if you want, the lecture process as a method by which the lecture notes of the instructor get transferred to the notebooks of the students without passing through the brains of either. Well, that was precisely what was happening in my classroom. Anyway, so I thought, okay, let's hand them out at the beginning of each class period. So I put them out in the beginning, and much to my relief, students wouldn't just walk in, grab the notes, and leave. No, they grabbed the notes, sat down, and they still copied everything because they had no time to read the notes. Anyway, that year went by, I got my high ratings, and the next year that I taught, I thought, you know what, rather than handing out these lecture notes piecemeal, lecture by lecture, a week before the semester starts, I'm going to take the whole set of notes, bring it to the copy place, and on the first day of class, the students get the complete packet of notes for the entire semester. You know what the unexpected result was? The unexpected result was that on their end of semester questionnaires, about half a dozen students wrote, Professor Mazur is lecturing straight from his lecture notes. Hello? What was I supposed to do? Develop another set of lecture notes to lecture from that was different from the one I handed out? I mean, I was livid. These ungrateful students. But they had a point. I was lecturing from my lecture notes. I was focusing on transferring information. And I should have listened to my students. So the question really is that all there is to education? And I think that if I would have asked the question before showing you this screen, I clicked the button a little bit too eagerly here, most of you would have agreed, no, there is more needed. What needs to happen is that as a learner, you need to assimilate that information. You need to build mental models that you can apply in situations that you have not encountered before. Because what is the true measure of learning? Is the true measure of learning being able to do exactly what you've learned? No. True measure of learning is being able to take whatever you've learned in the classroom and apply that in a new context. Which is, something that's really hard to A, assess, and B, achieve, I think. But anyway, let's think back of us teachers here, and I see there are a couple of younger people here who are either postdocs or graduate students, so it may, you have to think back of your undergraduate years. Where did that assimilation for you and for me take place? I've in the past few years, in the past 2 decades, I've been asking myself that question quite often. Where did I learn what I learned? Where did I become what I am now? Where did I build those mental models? Where did you do it? Did it happen in the classroom while you were listening to your instructor's talk? Well, maybe a tiny little bit, but I think for most of us, this assimilation, which is perhaps the most important part of the educational process, happened outside of the classroom when we're trying to resolve things we had not understood, or when we're trying to apply whatever we'd heard in the classroom in homework and in other problems that we were facing. So I think most of the learning in the traditional approach to teaching does not take place in the classroom, it takes place outside of the classroom. And if you think of education as a two-step process, 1, information transfer, and 2, assimilation of that information, and you ask yourself which of these 2 steps is the hardest, I think we all agree it's the second one. It's sort of ironic that in our traditional approach to teaching, we put all of our effort in the easy part, especially now that we live in an information age, right? And in the extreme case, you could just videotape a lecture and have people look at the lecture. It has a lot of advantages because A, they can see that their convenience, students, right? If they don't understand something, you can hit the pause button and think. You can't do that in a real classroom. Or you can rewind. And we all know how many questions get asked in a standard lecture, so you don't lose much interactivity either. Right? So I think the key point is really to try to pay attention to this assimilation. And this became clear to me when I first gave this FCI, that there was more to education than just lecturing, as we heard before. This is a histogram of scores on the horizontal scale. There are 29 questions on the FCI, so 29 out of 29, that top bin there, is full score. When I took the test, I got 28 out of 29. Must have misread a question or something like that. I actually made a real mistake. And as you can see, there are 2 students in my class back in 1990 when I taught a totally traditional class who on the pretest, on the first day of class, got 29 out of 29. They scored higher than I scored. Hessinus identifies 23 as the cutoff for Newtonian understanding. If you score below 23, you're still partially an Aristotelian thinker. In other words, you connect velocity with force, motion and force, rather than acceleration and force. And it's sort of surprising because most of the students at Harvard have had high school physics, and almost all have had an advanced placement physics course, which is a college-level physics course taught at the high school level, and they've earned 5 out of 5 on that. And in spite of that 5 out of 5, over 60% scores below 23. Anyway, I can't take any responsibility for that because I haven't taught them yet, right? This is the pre-test. So let's look at the post-test and see how much 1 semester of award-winning teaching by yours truly does to change this distribution. Did you see that? Let me put the 2 distributions on top of one another. At least there's a gain. But as you can see, the gain is minimum, and there's still a very large fraction of students who is an Aristotelian thinker at the end of the semester. Let's plot this a little bit differently. Let's take this blue distribution, the pretest, take the average. The class average was 70%, right? 70% of 29, whatever that was. So we put that initial score, class average score, on the horizontal scale. And then you take the red distribution, you get 78%, so the gain was 8%. There is a data point that represents these 2 graphs together in just 1 data point. What could the gain have been? Well, we had 70 initially, so we could have gained 30%, right? Perfect final score is the diagonal line that you see there. And as you can see, at least I've moved towards that diagonal line, not away from it, but it's not very high. Let's compare it to other universities which have a less selective admissions process, all the way from 2-year colleges on the far left to a lone Ivy League school. And you can see that the gain is low everywhere. Actually, it's lowest in my class, or almost lowest. You can see the 2-year college on the far left has a higher gain, 20%. But that's because they start out much, much lower. They have a much larger. But notice that if you take all of these data together, there's a trend there. All of them accomplish about 1/4 of the maximum gain they could and perhaps should accomplish, right? Whether it's a 2-year college, which is not very selective at all, to an Ivy League school, the traditional class is very ineffective at teaching Newton's law. So it's not the transfer of information that matters, but the assimilation. Anyway, that was not my immediate conclusion when I saw these data that I just showed to you. For a moment I thought, Eric, after all this, maybe you're not that good a teacher. But that could obviously not be true, right? So I didn't dwell on that possibility too long. So what's another way of explaining that poor result? Dumb students. But at Harvard, that's difficult to claim. We're a very selective admissions process. So I thought about it a little bit, and then my brain came up with the perfect excuse. Guess what it was? I just want to tell you this because I want to show you how desperate we are to always justify what we do and come up with other excuses.
Bad exam.
Bad what?
Exam.
Bad test. You mean perfect. Usually I have to pull on an audience. Exactly. Bad test. There had to be something wrong with this test. I mean, let's face it. Heavy truck, light car, right? You're going to be in a collision. You know that the effect of the impact is going to be less on the heavy truck than on the small car. You don't need to take physics for that, right? So maybe it was just a matter of semantics. After all, when I asked students what is Newton's third law, they had no trouble saying FAB equals FBA. And in most problems, they would even apply that law correctly. So I thought maybe this is just a matter of semantics and they're misleading questions. Had nothing to do with the students and nothing to do with me being a bad teacher. So I decided to do some testing of my own. I decided on midterm examination to pair 2 types of problem, a traditional problem out of a textbook and a completely word-based problem on the same subject on the same day. And it is while doing that that I discovered what is perhaps the most important thing I'm going to present to you today, namely that our conventional assessment can be very, very misleading. We're painting a rosy picture for ourselves because we're testing for what we want to see, not what we actually want to accomplish. So I'm going to give you an example, and unfortunately this involves some physics, and it involves physics where very few people have intuitive notion. That was deliberate, right? I wanted to get away from forces and all kinds of concepts where we have intuitive notions. I decided I was going to do some testing in DC circuits, electrical circuits. And I decided on a midterm examination, no multiple choice here, on a midterm examination to put 2 questions on circuits, one straight out of a textbook, this one here. These little wiggly lines are called resistors, and there are 3 of them as you can see, and there are 2 batteries, one 12-volt battery and one 8-volt battery, and the students were asked to calculate the current through the 2-ohm resistor and the potential difference between the points P and Q. I could ask the physicists and electrical engineers here to take a piece of paper, and we could spend 10 minutes working on this problem. And I would do the same. It's not very hard, but it's about 2/3 of a page of algebra. But I'm sure that if after 10 minutes we were to compare our answers, we would not find one answer, we'd find a range of answers. Because it's very easy to make a mistake as you go through 2/3 of a page of algebra. And I'm sure that many of us, including myself, would have made an incorrect substitution or some error somewhere. Okay, so this was problem number 5 out of 5 on a midterm examination. On that same examination, I put this problem. 3 light bulbs, A, B, and C, are connected in series, like the light bulbs in a Christmas tree, one after the other, to a battery, which is on the right side. And then there's this switch S here, which can short out. Don't do this at home tonight, okay? It's dangerous. Which can short out the last light bulb. Well, a short, for your information, is an electrical connection that has no resistance. So when you do this, all of the current goes through the switch S, and nothing goes through the light bulb. That light bulb C goes out. And the students were asked to answer the following questions. And the only thing they had to say was it increases, it decreases, or it stays the same. No need to give any calculation or any quantitative information. Just tell me whether it's increase, decrease, or stay the same. And I told them that they didn't even have to justify it, just write down the answer, which is a bad idea because you should always check for reasoning, not for the answer. But anyway, that year, that's what I did. So what happens to the intensities of A, B, and C? What happens to the currents through the battery? What happens to the potential differences across the light bulbs? And what happens to the total power dissipated? If you understand DC circuits, it takes 30 seconds to answer this question. And of those 30 seconds, you spend probably 25 on part E. The rest you just answer. It's just, you know. Anyway, what I didn't tell you at the beginning of my talk was that when we teach large courses like the pre-med course, we have 2 instructors teaching it. So in order to put this on the exam, I had to convince my colleague with whom I was teaching that this was a good exam problem. So I gave him a handwritten draft of this problem, and he looked at it, and then he looked up at me and he said, "Eric, you're out of your mind." And I said, "No, I don't think I'm out of my mind." He had not been part of the mechanics part of the semester, so I told him about the FCI. And he said, "But Eric, we only have 5 problems on this exam. We cannot give away 20%. And I said, "Well, I hope we're giving away 20%, but I'm not sure." I had been the one teaching DC circuits, so I thought it was my prerogative to determine how we're going to examine the students. Anyway, I had to argue with him for half an hour, and he finally relented, mostly because we didn't have any other viable candidate, and we made this problem number 1, the warm-up problem. Well, it turns out the students overheated on this problem. Professor Mazur, said one student, "That problem number 1 was the hardest problem on the exam." Or another student said to me, I didn't know how to get started on this problem." What do you mean getting started? If you started, you're done. Anyway, I decided I was going to grade this because I thought it would be really easy, right? I just asked the students to write increase, decrease, stay the same. We had 250 students, so I thought it could be done in 2 hours by simply looking quickly for those words. Bad mistake. It took me an entire weekend. Why? Because the students had freaked out on this problem. Some had written 6 pages in their examination booklets, writing down everything they knew about DC circuits in hope of somehow saying the right thing. And I had to read it all. Well, by the time I'd finished the grading, it was clear we had a problem. On the left, you see a histogram of scores out of 10 for the traditional problem, the first one I showed. And on the right, you see the score for the conceptual one. The average for the conventional one is 7 out of 10. The average for the conceptual is 5 out of 10. Do you see that huge peak at 2? Right? About half the class has 2 points. Well, it turns out, because they'd written down so much, I was able to reconstruct their thinking. And this is the last physics, but I have to amuse the physicists and the engineers in this crowd here, so I can't resist telling you this, okay? If you can't follow, it doesn't matter, and we're done with physics after this. But this is what 50% of my Harvard pre-meds had assumed. When you close that switch S, nothing happens to the current here through A and B. After all, you know, the switch is ahead, so it doesn't know the switch is coming, right? So it's just going to continue to go to that junction as it did before. That's wrong, right? Because if there's an accident on a highway somewhere happening in front of you, traffic backs up. It's not different from electrons moving through wires. So they lost 2 points on part A because they said nothing changes. And they should have said it increases because there are only 2 rather than 3 light bulbs connected. Anyway, but then comes the big question, what happens to C? So now the students have to decide how much of the current is going to go through the switch, the short, and how much through the light bulb. What do you think 50% of my Harvard students assumed? Half and half. Half is going to take a right turn, the other half is going to go straight. So if you say half, what does that mean for the intensity of light bulb C? They wrote down it decreases. You know what? That's where they got their 2 points. Of course, it goes off, but I had to be fair and give them their 2 points because there was no choice off. These are pre-meds, you know, some are going to be surgeons later on who do bypass surgery. Pretty scary. Anyway, since these are the same students on the same day and the same subject, let's investigate the correlation between scores. Let's plot for each student the performance on one type of problem versus the other and see how much of a line we get. Well, I'm afraid I have to disappoint you. There are data points all over the place. But if you're willing to relax your definition of a line a little bit, you find that about 50% does equally well here at the top, right? Well on one, well on the other, or equally poorly on both types of problem. But now let's look around this line or band or whatever you want to call it. 40% lies below this band, meaning they do better on the conventional problem than they do on the conceptual one. In fact, this data point here represents 6 students. They lie right on top of one another. They got 10 out of 10 on the traditional problem, everything correct, but they didn't even manage to get their 2 free points on the conceptual one. Now look here, there's hardly anyone there. This is white. The 9% is not a data point, right? This is white, meaning somebody who does well on the conceptual problem tends to do well on the traditional problem. Now, when I saw this, a lot of things fell into place. Who are these 40% of the students? What are they? Why are they there? It's a question to you. They're good exam takers, but what does that mean? They memorize, they apply rote procedures to solving problem. They solve by rote. Can we blame the students for that? No. Open any science textbook, and I'm going to quote from a physics textbook, somewhere on page 20, there's this box that says problem-solving strategy. I'm sure you've seen them, right? Read the problem, make a sketch, choose your axis, and so on. Imagine you're pre-med. You've heard nothing but horror stories about physics. Yet, you know that admission to medical school hinges on your performance in physics, among other things. It's very important to get a good grade. Did my microphone just give out? Yep. Can you still hear me? Whoops. Can you still hear me well, or is it, yeah? Okay, so we'll continue. Anyway, so you know that your admission to medical school hinges on this grade. And now you see on page 20 this box that says problem-solving strategy. You think, my key to success. You pull out your yellow highlighter and highlight the entire box. It's already been highlighted by the publisher, but you highlight it anyway. And you memorize the strategy. Then comes the first homework set. You take problem number 1, and you take the strategy, and you apply it, and it works. Why does it work? Because most textbook problems are designed to match the strategy. And you think, oh, maybe physics is not that bad after all, and I'm going to get into Johns Hopkins Medical School. And you get excited. And now you apply it to problem number 2, and it works again. And you apply it to problem number 3, and it works again. Now, I forgot to tell you that in spite of my high evaluations early on in my teaching career, a number of students, while still giving me high evaluation, would write at the bottom, physics is boring, or physics sucks. I could never make any sense out of it, but imagine that you're simply blindly applying strategies to problems, strategies you do not really understand. I have to agree, that is boring. It's like throwing out the science, right? You're throwing out all the beauty of the science, and you've turned science into, which has a very tentative procedure in general to it, into something that's completely prescribed. Anyway, now comes problem number 4 on your homework. And here's the strategy, here's the problem. You try, it doesn't work. Why? Because, as we all know, you can't solve all problems with a simple strategy. So now imagine you're a student, 40% in my class at Harvard, who has been misled to believe that you can do rote algorithmic problem solving, and you discover that the rote algorithmic problem solving only works 75% of the time. You get mad. You get frustrated because you don't understand why it doesn't work for 25% of the time. You get mad at the teacher. What kind of a teacher is this who gives me a recipe that only works 75% of the time? It should work 100% of the time. So In my class at Harvard, 40% of the students are likely to A, become bored, and B, become very frustrated with the approach. Now imagine you're one of these students and you come to the exam. I'm going to borrow one of these pieces of paper for a moment. And you can probably still vividly remember those moments when you took large exams in large classrooms, right? Let's say it's physics. You're still looking through your notes, you're sharpening your pencil, and the professor and the teaching assistant are handing out the exam, printed side down, right, because everybody has to start at the same time. And then the professor says, please put your books away. You may begin. Turns completely silent. And you hear the sound of 150 exams being turned around. Do you remember that moment? Yes, right? I do too. And you turn it around, and as you turn it around, let's go back here for a moment. As you turn it around and you start seeing the printed ink on the paper, you see this diagram. What is the first thought that crosses your mind? Physicists in the audience have to answer this.
I can do this.
Well, I need more specifics.
I've done this.
More specifics. How?
Recipes.
Which recipe? Kirchhoff's laws, exactly. Finally, I'm hearing it there. Kirchhoff's law, because you have been pre-programmed. If you see a problem that has a diagram with wiggly lines, it means it's a Kirchhoff's law problem. You have Kirchhoff's laws, for those of you who don't know, are the laws that describe how currents distribute themselves in DC circuits. You haven't even read the words. And you already, it's only 1 second into the exam, the time to lift a piece of paper, and you already know problem number 5 is a Kirchhoff's law problem. How much physics is left? None. You just have to take these numbers, which are beautifully presented in a very nice diagram. Incidentally, no electrical diagram made in the world looks like that. They look very different, right? But here they've been very nicely presented. And the only thing you need to do is take those numbers, put them in Kirchhoff's law, turn the crank, and out comes the right answer. Do the students understand Kirchhoff's law? No, because if they did, they would have had no problem answering that question, right? So it was pure rote memorization. So that's when I finally asked myself the question, what should I do? I had already been teaching, 7 years at Harvard when that question finally came up. And the first thing I thought was, well, maybe I should teach graduate courses. But I wasn't willing to give up that quickly. And it turns out that, like so many other good things that happened in my life, the solution presented itself completely serendipitously. I told you that I was worried that the students would be offended by the simplicity of this FCI, right, a moment ago. Well, they weren't at all. They were horrified. And because they knew they had this midterm coming up, and now this test, according to the score that I was giving them, showed that they didn't understand something that they were supposed to have learned in week 2. So they asked for me to organize a special session in the evening where we would go through each and every single question on the FCI. So we went through each and every question. When we got to the question of the heavy truck and the light car, I made a free body diagram of the car on one side, the truck on the other side of the board. I drew all the force vectors, and then I said, by Newton's third law, the force of the truck on the car is equal in magnitude to the force of the car on the truck. I mean, what else is there to explain about it, right? So I turned around and I could see at once that they were confused by the statement I just made. So I said, does anybody have a question? And I just got these blank stares. I mean, they were so confused they couldn't even articulate a question. You know how it is, right? When you're struggling with something, you can't even really pinpoint where it is that your difficulty is. So given that there was nothing coming back, as a teacher, there are 2 things you can do. Just move on, right? But I knew this was serious, so I thought, okay, I'm going to redo it. And I redid it, and I thought, this time I'm going to bring in acceleration, right? Because even though the forces are the same magnitude, the truck is a lot heavier. Therefore, a force of a given magnitude has less effect on the truck than on the car. So I explained all of that, and I turned around triumphantly from the board, knowing I'd nailed it this time, only to see that they were even more confused. And I really had no idea how to, they couldn't articulate a question still. I had no idea how to better explain it. But this was serious, right? I mean, Newton's third law. I mean, you got to master that before you do anything else. But I knew that about half of them had correctly answered the question on the FCI. So I did something I'd never done in my class before, and it was sort of out of desperation. I said, why don't you discuss it with your neighbor? And something happened in my classroom that I'd never seen before. The entire classroom erupted in chaos. They forgot about me in front of the class. They were all engaged in this discussion. You know, normally I would lecture, and then I would stop and then say, does anybody have a question? Anybody? And you know how it is, right? Silence. The students don't even want to make eye contact. They look down. It's only if you wait long enough, it's always the same person in the front row who raises his or her hand. Most of them don't want to be engaged at all, right? Here they were all engaged. And what happened was that within 90 seconds or 2 minutes, they'd figured it out among themselves. And that really surprised me. But imagine you have Mary and John sitting next to each other. Mary has the right answer because she understands it. John does not understand it, does not have the right answer. On average, Mary is more likely to convince John than the other way around, right? Force of logic reasoning. Personalities aside for the time being. I'm talking about here on average, right? But what is more, and this is perhaps the most important point, is that Mary is more likely to convince John than Professor Mazur in front of the class. Why? Because Mary has only recently learned it and still knows what the conceptual difficulties are that the beginning learner has. Whereas Professor Mazur learned it such a long time ago, to him it is so clear that it becomes very difficult to understand what the difficulties are that John has. It's sort of ironic. He would say the longer you teach something, the better you know something, the more qualified you are to teaching it. And I'm sort of making the opposite statement, right? The more qualified you become, the more difficult it becomes to teach because you are no longer aware of the conceptual difficulties that a beginning learner has. Anyway, when I saw that, I thought, maybe there's a way to exploit that in the classroom. And if we think of teaching as a two-step process, one, transfer of information, two, assimilation of this information, let's throw the information transfer out. Let's have the students watch a video of a lecture or read a textbook or whatever before coming to class. And in class, rather than focusing on the transfer of information, we're going to help the students assimilate the material. So in my classes right now, I give the students, first of all, a pre-class reading assignment. In business schools and law schools, by the way, that's the standard procedure, right? No professor in a business or law school would just stand there in front of his class lecturing. You assign a case, and then in the class you discuss the case. I think in literature, you're way ahead of us too, because no literature professor would start reading A Midsummer Night's Dream to his or her student. Maybe little pieces of it, but not the whole play. And then you'd use class time to discuss it, put in historical context. So in class, we put things in context and don't cover everything. The coverage is determined by the reading, but going to depths. And I do that by asking questions, which I call concept test. So I'll walk into class, I'll talk a few minutes, and then I put the first question on the overhead or projected on the screen. I give the students a minute to think about that question. I ask them to commit to an answer. If it's multiple choice, we use clickers, which is something that started 19 years ago or 18 years ago in my classroom. First we had wired ones, then they became wireless. Now they're all over the place. Now I can see that even here they're built in. There's a system built in the lectern for clickers, so they must have migrated to Waterloo as well. I wish I had patented that and anyway, so after committing to an individual answer, if they're not multiple choice, I ask the students to write the answer on a piece of paper. And then I tell them, try to find a neighbor who has a different answer and then convince that neighbor of your answer. Total chaos. Then I ask them to re-answer the question. And I have eventually an explanation. So let's look at a little video that shows how that happens in practice. So I begin by reading the question with the students. Uniform magnetic field in the direction. And this is sort of condensed. This is only 1 minute out of a 5-minute period. But I make sure that the students understand the question. So So they think I do not want them to talk to me. After a while, they get very eager to talk right away. But I want everybody to commit individually to an answer. There's agreement here. So turn to your neighbor and see if you can convince one another of the correct choice. We've got 5 more minutes. You use that? Okay. So the aha moment there, that's perhaps the most gratifying thing about teaching this way. As you see the students go, you'll see, all of a sudden it clicks into place. And the great thing, as you heard in the introduction by the Associate Dean here, once you figure it out, it's there to stay with you, right? Yes?
Did you show them the poll before they talk to each other?
The question here is, do I show the poll before they talk? No, I do not. Because I want the question to be such that there's already a slight majority for the right answer, right? I mean, if you have 5 choices and the right answer is only 20% or 15%, there are just not enough students in the classroom to help others. So you want the questions at the right level so there are enough students who can explain it to others. If you show the distribution, they very quickly figure out what might be the right choice. So I never show the distribution before. I may show it after the discussion, I may show before and after to them, right? I do show it after them. So there are 2 things actually in this process. One, it's active, not passive. You cannot sleep through the class periods because every few minutes your neighbor will start talking to you. Believe it or not, some students actually don't like that. They'd rather be sleeping, but that's too bad. So it's active. The other thing is there's now a 2-way flow of information. It's not just me dumping words into the classroom. There's information coming back from the classroom at me. I find out then and there whether students get something or not. I don't have to wait till the midterm to discover, oh my God, they didn't figure this out, right? And I can do something about it then and there. And it's not just that there's information coming back to me, it comes back to the students too, because after the second vote, I show the distribution. If you're among the 10-15% who still has the wrong answer, it shows where you stand with respect to the rest of the class, and it sends an alarm signal, oh, I better look at this after class. It's continuous formative assessment rather than the standard summative assessment that we have in our classrooms. So last few minutes, and I see I'm running over a few minutes, but let's answer this question, is it any good? And I'm going to show you some data. Now, physicists love to show typical data, and the word typical is a code word. It means the best data I've ever obtained in my career. Well, these are not typical. This was 1991, the first year that I implemented peer instruction. I had no idea what the right questions were. And there were many questions that I asked in class which turned out to be either too hard or too easy. And if they're too hard or too easy, the discussion is not very meaningful, right? You have to adjust the level of the questions to your audience. Okay, but I did it groping in the dark with questions in the first year, and this is the result. First of all, the pretest, some of the most reproducible data I have ever obtained in my entire career. I can't take credit for that because it's the Harvard Admissions Office, I guess, that's responsible for that. The noise is different from year to year, but it's amazingly stable. Here's the post-test. Now, just in and of itself, yes, there are still some students who don't understand Newtonian laws and score below 23, but it's now far, far less. And the highest bins now have the largest counts. Did I teach to the test? I made sure that it was not a single question in class or on the homework or on the exams that came close to any of the questions on the FCI. I mean, I didn't want to just, teach to the test. In fact, that summer in 1991, I was so excited by these results that I decided to submit an abstract for the AAPT, American Association of Physics Teachers, summer meeting, which was held in Vancouver that year. Nobody knew about me in education, so all I got was an 8-minute contributed talk. So I traveled out to Vancouver, and I spent 4 of my precious 8 minutes documenting that I had not taught to the test. I didn't want anybody to accuse me of just, teaching to the test. At the end of my talk, somebody in the back raised his hand and he said, "Don't worry about teaching to the test. We've tried it. It doesn't work." Anyway, you see that there's a very substantial gain now. If we put it on this plot here, the Hague plot, you can see that instead of an 8% gain, we have a 16% gain. And in subsequent years, we were able to triple that gain to 24 by making a better choice of questions to ask in class. And in fact, the highest data point was not obtained by me, but by two of my colleagues when I was in the year that I was on sabbatical. So it's not dependent on the individual teacher either. What about other places? So these other places here that taught before traditionally, when they switched to interactive teaching, the gain went up substantially. As you can see, there's maybe only one data point where there's no difference, but there's an overwhelming evidence for improving the learning gains. And if you take all of the data together, you don't just select the best data, you see that just implementing peer instruction doubles the gain. But this is just a very small part of the curriculum, right, of what is taught in week 2. What about problem solving? After all, some of the students are not pre-meds, they're engineers. They will have to come up with numbers, right? If you design a bridge, which conceptually is spectacular and correct, but unfortunately, by the time the first truck rolls over, it collapses because you made a 2 order of magnitude mistake in calculating something, you don't get any credit, right? You're in trouble. So I thought, my colleagues are going to ask me this question, how do I answer that? Well, I knew of only one way, I still know of only one way, and that is you repeat an old exam. I had never ever repeated a single exam question. So by 1991, when I did this, I taught the course for 7 years. At Harvard, we keep 3 years' worth of exam on file in the libraries. But even a student who would have had access somehow to all of my exams would have immediately concluded Professor Mazur never repeats an exam. So there was no reason for the students to assume that, nor did they really have access to an exam going back as far as 1985. Fortunately, I had kept meticulous data. I didn't know I was going to get into physics education research, but I'm a database junkie, so I'd simply taken all of the data from my class and put them in databases and spreadsheets. And in 1991, I was able to reproduce this distribution. Now, when I did that, and when I decided to repeat the 1985 final exam in 1991, I looked at this data. The average was about 62%. And I said to myself, look, as long as the score doesn't deviate too much from 62 down, and I was worried that it was going to go down a little bit, I'm happy. Why was I worried that it was going down? Well, in 1991, I decided to omit any problem solving in class. I told myself, as a student, you don't derive much benefit seeing the instructor with his back towards you solve a problem for you. You don't learn to play the piano by listening to CDs of Murray Pariah playing the piano. Nor do you train for a marathon by sitting in front of the TV, eating popcorn, watching DVDs of marathon runners. You've got to do the running. Likewise, you learn problem solving by doing the problem solving, not by watching a professor doing the problem solving. And if I solve a problem for the student on the board, all they do is copy the solution in their notes. I might as well just give them a photocopied solution and they can look at it later. So in 1991, it eliminated all problem solving in class. There was still problem solving on the problem sets. There was problem solving in discussion sections, but not in the lecture hall. But you know what? In spite of the diminished emphasis on problem solving in class, the students ended up doing better. Statistically significantly better. The average went up from 62% to 68%. And as you can see, we cut in the low end tail of the distribution. So what does this say? This says that better understanding leads to better problem solving. It's so almost like an obvious statement, right? But, and this is the key point I want to leave with you today, the opposite of this statement is not true. Good problem solving does not always indicate understanding, as this example of the 2 circuit problem shows. I had been fooling myself into believing that I did a good job. where in fact the students were just memorizing and regurgitating and then probably promptly forgetting 2 weeks after the final exam everything I taught them. And I'm sure you can think of many courses you took where you don't remember any of the content at all anymore. Probably most of them, unless they're related to the activity that you're currently involved in. So I had a little clip of what the students think of this, but I'm going to skip that. I'm just moving. Let's see. Can I go? So in summary, I think the traditional indicators of success in education are misleading. The end of semester evaluation. I got high evaluations. Students learned next to nothing. And they did well on exams, and I thought they learned, but they were just turning the crank, so to speak. The other thing is that education is no longer about information. Another step that I've taken is that right now I make everything open book. We live in an information age. I can do my work with access to information. In fact, all of us can do our work with access to information. So why is it important to memorize anything? The creativity doesn't come from the memorization. The creativity comes from applying things that we have discovered, found out, formulated in a new context. So a number of years ago, I decided I was going to make every exam completely open book. Students can bring whatever they want to an exam, except another living person. Dead person is okay, living person, no. So they can bring whatever they want to the exam. And you know what? It has two effects. One is it drives the message home that learning is not about memorization. Yeah, you still have to understand it, and you have to know where to find the information, but you don't have to just remember everything. You can look it up. I can do my work without knowing. I mean, a number of years ago, it would have been difficult for me to do my work without knowing Planck's constant. Let's just pick one. But now, if I don't know what Planck's constant is, I can just pull out my iPhone, press the Google button, and say Planck's constant, and then a second later I have it to 13 digits, which is impossible for me to remember, and I have the latest value. Right? So information comes at us from everywhere. So one is it drives the message, it's not about memorization. But two, the biggest impact was actually on me, because it showed to me that a lot of my old exam problems were meaningless, because they were just questions that you could look up in the book. They were regurgitation questions. Now, knowing that my students will have access to whatever information is out there, I have to become much more creative at how I assess them. And students know that. They cannot accuse me of asking questions that were not in a textbook, because why would I ask questions that are in a textbook if they bring the textbook to the exam? So I urge you, I almost challenge you to think about that in your own courses. It really shifts the focus from information to knowing what to do with the information. Okay, thank you so much for your attention. I've kept you here longer than I wanted to, and I want to have some discussion.